My name is Deborah Avant, and I direct the C Center here at Korbel. And this is our very first Denver Dialogues event of the year. This year, our Denver Dialogues are related to our Carnegie Corporation-funded project on inclusive approaches to violence reduction, peace building, and governance. And one of the key initiatives in this project that I know many of you are familiar with is our Inclusive Global Leadership Initiative, or IGLI, which focuses specifically on how the inclusion of women matters. And there's a number of different dimensions to this, but one of them is that we're really going to focus our Denver Dialogue events this year on women leaders. And so by showcasing women leaders and drawing in different underrepresented communities, we're hoping to sort of encourage a more inclusive approach to leadership. This IGLI program is being directed by Marie Berry, my colleague. Is Marie here? I think Marie's here. And my other colleague, Erica Chenoweth. And so they're going to do a lot of the legwork on the Denver Dialogues. And in fact, Erica's going to do the dialoguing with our guests today. But today's speaker is particularly appropriate for this theme. And you'll learn more about that when you hear more about Mary King's background. But when I was talking to her yesterday, I remember, guys, I spent the last few weeks in Geneva, and while I was there, went to a film screening of a movie called Black Code, which is a fabulous movie, a documentary about the way that the internet is doing all kinds of nefarious things, as well as the positive things that we had hoped it would do. And as the Q&A went on and on, people were getting more and more depressed about just what kind of world we were facing. And a woman raised her hand and she said, in the midst of all this, how do we cultivate trust and love? And I thought, I am totally not in the US because this is not a question that will frequently come up in the United States. But then I was thinking, why? I mean, in many respects, environments and orders that can sort of cultivate trust and love are sort of fundamental to some of the things that we care about in the world. And so it was kind of like this a special place in my heart for this woman, kind of bringing up this kind of fundamental question in the midst of all of this skeptical analysis of the internet. But I think it's key when we're sort of thinking about moving forward and we're thinking about inclusive approaches to be able to think strategically about the kinds of things that can cultivate the environments for the sorts of trust and love and other kinds of things that we value without kind of losing sight of those values. And I really got the sense, talking to Mary yesterday, that she's somebody who can help us a lot with that, sort of thinking about the strategy, but keeping your eye on the ball. And she's had a life of contributing to this kind of strategizing and devoting her energy to building trust and love and a variety of other things. And so I think that she will do a lot to sort of move us closer to those maybe naive values that we're looking for, but in a strategic way that will be perhaps more consequential. But to introduce her, let me introduce my colleague Erica Chenoweth, and she's going to do the introduction, and then she'll also do the dialoguing. So Erica, please come on up.
Good afternoon. Thank you so much for joining us for this exciting event today. I'm so thrilled that I get the honor of introducing this amazing person, my friend, colleague, and one of my favorite human beings on this planet, Mary Elizabeth King. I'm going to talk a little bit about Mary's life, and then I'm going to talk about some of the things that she's brought to me as a cipher for what she's brought to the world. by means of introduction, and then you'll hear from her a little bit about her story. So after graduating from Ohio Wesleyan University and working with Ella Baker and Professor Howard Zinn, Mary King went to work for the U.S. Civil Rights Movement, serving on the staff of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, or SNCC, in Atlanta. There she joined civil rights legend Julian Bond in running the organization's communications shop. In 1964, she was dispatched to Jackson, Mississippi to manage communications for Mississippi's storied Freedom Summer. While serving in SNCC's communications department, King tallied information about the atrocities committed against local movements associated with SNCC by vigilante groups. She liaised with national media outlets, maintained a robust telephone network, scoured affidavits and reports and news articles, and wrote her own news releases about the atrocities. When civil rights workers James Earl Chaney, Andrew Goodman, and Michael Schwerner were murdered in Mississippi in 1964, King was appointed the somber task of notifying the Cheneys and the Goodmans of their son's disappearance. A decade later, as a presidential appointee in the Carter administration, confirmed by the Senate, King had worldwide oversight of the Peace Corps, along with the Domestic Vista program and other national volunteer service programs. Mary King is also an accomplished academic. Since 2002, she's been professor of peace and conflict studies at the UN-affiliated University for Peace based in Costa Rica. She's also a distinguished Rothermere American Institute Fellow at the University of Oxford in Britain, and a distinguished scholar with American University's School of International Service in Washington, D.C. Mary King's latest book, Gandhian Nonviolent Struggle and Untouchability in South India, the 1924-25 Vaikom Satyagraha and the Mechanisms of Change, was published in 2015. Among her other works are Freedom Song, a personal story of the 1960s civil rights movement, for which she received a 1988 Robert F. Kennedy Memorial Book Award, Mahatma Gandhi and Martin Luther King Jr., The Power of Nonviolent Action, and A Quiet Revolution, the First Palestinian Intifada and Nonviolent Resistance. In a 2009 collaboration with the New York Times, King wrote a reference volume on emerging democracies in Eastern Europe and the national nonviolent revolutions that brought about democratic transitions, playing a definable role in ending the Cold War. King's collection of prestigious awards includes the Jamnalal Bajaj International Prize in Mumbai, the Al-Hibri Peace Education Prize, and the James Lawson Award for Nonviolent Achievement. In 2011, Ohio Wesleyan University bestowed on her the Honorary Doctor of Laws degree. In that same year, she was elected a fellow by Aberystwyth University in Wales, where she did her doctoral work in international politics. She currently co-chairs the Academic Advisory Council for the International Center on Nonviolent Conflict, and she serves on the board of the Albert Einstein Institution. She's now the director of the new James Lawson Institute, whose first assembly will be held in Los Angeles later this month. Now, I've had the pleasure of knowing Mary King personally for the past 10 years. She and I have had the privilege of participating in countless workshops on nonviolent struggle on multiple continents. Over the course of these experiences, I've learned so many things from her that are ciphers for what she's given to the world. And I'll mention 3 that are apropos of today's gathering. First, she is willing to take personal risks for justice and equality. Mary King was jailed and harassed during her time at SNCC. And in recounting her experience in SNCC in her book Freedom Song, she writes, quote, "We saw ourselves black and white together as a band of brothers and sisters and a circle of trust. The spirit that united us, not even the most worldly and cynical of my colleagues would today qualify or disagree, was such that we would have died for one another," end quote. She's never been naive to the risks one faces when challenging entrenched power, and she's fully aware of the difficulties that arise among diverse coalitions of people seeking justice. One of my favorite anecdotes about Mary is that when I asked her once, how often did people meet during the civil rights movement to try to plan mobilizations and strategy, she told me, well, we met every morning before class. I don't know what you all were doing in college, but the level of commitment is profound and inspiring. Second, Mary King's commitment to precision, reliability, and veracity in reporting during the civil rights movement and since earned her the nickname Meticulous Mary within the movement. Over 50 years later, the nickname still fits her, as you will come to see in her talk. King is a veritable walking encyclopedia in her attention to detail and recounting historical events, her thoroughness in storytelling, and her insistence that others do the same make her perhaps the most trusted chronicler of historical and contemporary civil resistance movements of our time. Third, King carries with her an immense depth of experience and wisdom with regard to engaged scholarship. She's one of the few people I know who came to academic life after committing herself and acting upon a deep and abiding moral purpose to better understand and elevate peace, justice, and alternatives to violence. Yet in her academic career, King has made significant contributions to the research fields of civil resistance, gender and peace building, and the link between scholarship and peace. Her own example has been absolutely critical in shaping my own practical and ethical commitments to engage scholarship. So we are terribly lucky to have Mary King with us today. I've given you only a snapshot of her professional and personal accomplishments, but we wanted to add, through the C Center, a bit of our own recognition of these unique contributions and accomplishments. So we honor her today with our Engaged Scholar Award. Mary, if you'll come up to pick it up. Perfect. Thank you. So help me to welcome Mary once again, congratulate her for the award, and welcome her remarks.
Thank you. This is beautiful.
I'm just going to put it down on the table for you.
Perfect.
Do you need your notes?
Thank you very much indeed. It's wonderful to be with you, and I want to thank Professor Deborah Avent for your kind and generous introduction. I could have spent 2 more hours talking with you yesterday. I'm sorry it was shortcutted. And Erica, this is the most extraordinary introduction that I have ever received. I thank you very much. It's been a pleasure for me to be here in Denver. I have a very close friend and family member who's in the audience, who lives in Denver, and I was so happy to be reunited, therefore, with my friend Erica and with Nicole Bagley. So I am going to be sharing with you a few lessons that I have learned along the way in the nonviolent struggles in which I've worked or researched. From childhood, my family nurtured me in standing up against injustice and unjust authority. There was nothing rebellious about my going to work for the civil rights movement. One of my forebears was an officer who served with Nathaniel Bacon in the failed 1676 rebellion against Governor Alexander Spotswood, who was the British representative in colonial Virginia. A somewhat closer in time ancestor was Henry Clay, the twice unsuccessful Whig candidate for president in 1832 and 1844, who famously said, "I would rather be right than president," and freed his slaves in his will. In 1962, in my senior year at Ohio Wesleyan University, I organized a student committee on race relations to support the Southern student sit-in campaigns that were then blazing across the South. These were all by people in their late teens or early 20s. As a result of my organizing of that committee, I was invited to travel south with a senior group from the National YWCA program. At Ohio Wesleyan, that was the place for students who were concerned about public affairs. In Nashville and Atlanta, I met Ella Baker, who's one of the great voices in U.S. social history, and Professor Howard Zinn, and I hope that his name at least is known to all of you. And I also met many of the young people working for SNCC, which Erica has explained as the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. Miraculously, as I was waiting to leave Ohio Wesleyan, a telephone call was diverted from the dormitory to me in the bus station, and I was asked on the phone, would I fly immediately to be interviewed by Ella Baker and Howard Zinn in North Carolina? So I called home and I said, Mama and Papa, I'm not coming home. I'm flying to North Carolina. And then I worked with these two extraordinary human beings for a full year before I went to work with SNCC. My job with Julian Bond was communications. This meant trying to get out nationally stories of the church burnings, night riders, beatings, deaths, atrocities against African Americans. Editors of Southern white-owned newspapers routinely failed to report such brutalities. Reporters regularly told us that this was not considered newsworthy, so we had to compensate. I spent Christmas 1963 in Atlanta City Jail called Big Rock. A Kenyan government minister, Odinga Oginga, had come to Atlanta because he wanted to meet movement people, and a couple of our group went to get a cup of coffee next door. They were refused service. And all of us 22 staff members who had come to meet with him from the main Atlanta SNCC office joined them. Now, what's important in this story is, for those of you who are working in communications like Autumn and Nathan and others, I was not supposed to go to jail. It was more important to be on the telephone breaking the news. But somehow I got dragooned into it. There was no way that I could say, oh, well, the rest of you go ahead and I'll go back to the office. I couldn't do that. So Julian Bond soon sent me to Danville, Virginia. Now, my great-great-great-grandfather, Wright Johnson, and my grandfather had been Methodist ministers in Danville, and I had been to Danville as a child, going to family reunions in North Carolina. The atrocities being meted out by the city authorities of Danville, Virginia, were every much as bad as anything that happened in Birmingham in 1963, including the use of fire hoses against would-be black voter registrants. Fire hoses can break bones and enucleate eyeballs, as well as ripping clothing off people. The police in Danville were very clever. They harassed us by following us, driving in front. In other words, they would pose themselves right in front of the movement cars. And any failure, such as not putting on a turn, putting on your hand out. In those days, we didn't have turn signals. You put your hand out this way for left turn, you went this way for right, and down for stop. Any violation, and their sirens were on, and you were being arrested. I've never seen or heard of that since. I never went on a single demonstration in Danville. The only thing I used was a telephone and a manual typewriter. And yet I soon learned from movement lawyers that I was about to be indicted by a grand jury for acts of violence and war. The grand jury had dug up an archaic Virginia statute that held that it was illegal to incite the colored population, quote unquote, to acts of violence and war against the white population. This is the statute under which John Brown was hanged following the Harper's Ferry raid. So I had to escape across the river to a Catholic convent in North Carolina that took me in, and I was crouched down on the passenger side of the car. In 1964, Julian sent me over to Mississippi to run communications for Mississippi Freedom Summer. I guess I'd done a good enough job in Danville that he thought I should go on to Jackson. I lived in a weatherboard house opposite the gates of Tougaloo College, which was established for freed slaves in 1869 by missionaries on a former slave plantation. In Choctaw Indian language, the word Tougaloo means here the waters divide. It referred to a fork of two creeks on the campus. Almost daily during 1964 and 65, I would drive one of our secondhand cars from Tougaloo to a low, flat-roofed building in Jackson, which was headquarters for all the civil rights organizations working in Mississippi. You should bear in mind that SNCC had more full-time field secretaries than any other of the older civil rights organizations. So most of the other organizations were represented in more of a token sense. It was largely SNCC staff in the Mississippi Freedom Summer. COFO, or the Council of Federated Organizations, which is what was the group, the umbrella that we formed, warned that I might be a target and kept under surveillance by night riders and vigilantes who resented our presence. So I earnestly accepted the warnings and marked out 10 different routes for driving to and from Tougaloo College. Mississippi was a closed, isolated society. Its Jim Crow maintained with violence. No one associated with the movement could feel safe, and yet I felt protected by the local community people. I sensed this in unspoken ways. Frequent visits from neighbors bringing melons or vegetables, unplanned visits just to chat. We were civil rights, and we had come to join their struggle for rights that all Americans had been promised 200 years earlier. But strange as it seems, I felt that they provided me with a safety that they could not guarantee for themselves. I understood the irony that my neighbors, whose lives were narrowed by diminished rights and limited liberties, were safeguarding us gently and unobtrusively. They called us freedom riders, all of us, whether we'd been on the 1961 freedom rides or not. Now, Mississippi sharecroppers earned 25 or 30 cents an hour at that time. If you worked for 6 days in a week, you would take home $18. I was helping descendants of some of the most psychologically and physically abused peoples who've come to the United States. Yet it seemed to me that I was the one who benefited. My parents' steadfast beliefs about the equality of all human beings had not prepared me for the quiet benevolence, the innate kindness, something magnanimous of these Mississippians where I lived and worked. The Southern Black communities that welcomed me and protected me seemed not only to possess grandness of character, but appeared to have found the strength to forego the bigotry and loathing by which they were themselves oppressed. I believe they taught me some of life's deepest lessons. Now, returning to Ella Baker, she had traveled alone during the 1940s, the granddaughter of slaves, organizing branches of the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. It was she who brought together the student leaders of the Southern student sit-in campaigns in 1960, because she said there needed literally to be a coordinating committee for all of these leaders. The sit-ins had spread to 75 cities in only 2 months. They need to have a coordinating mechanism, she said. So until that time and the formation of SNCC, African American communities were using litigious methods to fight for justice. In other words, they were filing law cases. They were sending lawyers into courtrooms to fight. I write quite a bit about Miss Baker in my book, Freedom Song, if you want to check it out. She was concerned that one of the things we needed to do was to make civil rights a national issue, not a regional issue. And she also taught me one of the most important lessons that I've learned in my life, which I shall share with you, which is that the oppressed must define their own freedom. Mississippi Freedom Summer was also the first nurturing of leadership skills for many local women and women staff members in SNCC. SNCC in particularly was profoundly committed to women's participation, and it was because of Ella Baker and her thinking, and she was enormously influential with our Mississippi State Director, Robert Moses. She believed that leadership might come from anyone, and that the job of the organizer was to see it, to discern it, and then to work to develop that potential and that promise. And as a result, women, whatever their role, whether they were local people or whether they were volunteer lawyers or volunteer physicians, whatever they were doing, women were deriving knowledge, preparation, experience, and competencies in political organizing. I'll return to this in a moment. On the first day of Mississippi Freedom Summer, June 21st, 1964, 3 of my fellow workers, as Erica mentioned, James Chaney, Andrew Goodman, and Michael Schwerner, disappeared. And I was asked to phone the families and tell them that we suspected foul play. My notes from that day, which are now posted online, show that after midnight, I telephoned John Doerr at the Justice Department. We then had a Department of Justice that meant justice. Although there were limitations and problems, it was not what we would later see. But the people with whom I was working continued to work and press forward on all of the programs. They continued to build institutions in which, in the middle of dire circumstances, they could build toward the future. We organized an alternative political party. We organized a mock ballot joined by students from Yale and Stanford in 1963, in which 65,000 Black people cast ballots in a mock ballot just to prove the urgency and importance of voting. Imagine having to do that enormous organizing construction just to prove in a vote that didn't count that you indeed wanted to vote. They also built other institutions such as cooperatives and credit unions. Now, one of the things that Gandhi taught us is that in certain circumstances where there is very difficult injustice or change is going to require intergenerational commitment, is that one of the things you can do is to begin building institutions that are outside the nature of the oppression, so you can build the new while you're still in the old order. We did that a great deal in Mississippi because it was simply too dangerous to have direct action. There were no demonstrations in Mississippi to speak of, no sit-ins. We did voter registration, and we organized alternative institutions in which people could build for the future. Nathan, some of the institutions that you have studied in today's Mississippi are direct descendants and are outgrowths of what we were organizing in that summer. So the murders of my 3 interracial fellow workers brought the country face to face with what it had long denied, which is that law officers were in collusion with the vigilante and terror groups that were striking fear into the hearts of anyone, Black or white. Passage of the 1964 Civil Rights Act and the 1965 Voting Rights Act were immeasurably helped. The deaths of Andy, Jim, and Mickey rewrote American history. Many people came to understand that the national silence on race was poisonous. In 1967, Cecil Price, the deputy sheriff of Neshoba County, where Philadelphia is, which is where the 3 young men were abducted and murdered, were found guilty of delivering the 3 young men into the hands of their murderers. 7 Klansmen were convicted on federal charges of violating civil rights, but none served more than 6 years, and there were never any charges for the crime of murder. Cecil Price served 4.5 years at a federal penitentiary. So justice was late in coming, and it was partial. Now, one of the reasons that nonviolent struggle has attained its rising status as a means of effective methods for social change, such as Erica Chenoweth has documented. Erica has made an ineradicable mark globally on the documentation of nonviolent struggle. But one of the reasons that nonviolent struggle has attained the rising status that she's documenting is that our freedom movement actually helped the entire country. William Faulkner believed that the curse of slavery rested on the land in almost an Old Testament sense, passed from father to son. Yet our interracial movement, including a small but noteworthy number of white Southern participants, helped to end some of the opprobrium against the South for its history tormented by slavery and its sequelae. And in fact, in the past decade, authorities across the region have reopened cases of 18 slayings that dated to those years when I was working in Mississippi. And given my father's own family in 17th century Virginia and North Carolina, during the movement years, I often thought about the fact that we would be working on behalf of the entire southern region. I thought that what we were doing could end the stigma in the South and make it more prosperous. I believed that a movement that was seeking basic constitutional reforms for Black citizens who had been forensically disenfranchised in the southern U.S. states, where federal and state authorities had for a full century after the Emancipation Proclamation refused to accept responsibility, I believed it could make over the South. I still believe that a movement can do that for the South. We're on the right road, but we're not quite there yet. Now, when the New York Times reviewed my book, Freedom Song, that I wrote in 1987, the reviewer called me part of a, quote, tiny handful of white, female, heroic, unsung organizers of the Southern Civil Rights Movement. I really don't know about the heroic part. I guarantee you I was being a dutiful daughter. I was not being heroic. Furthermore, my years at the heart of the Civil Rights Movement marked the beginning of a deepening, lifelong process of studying nonviolent action, a remarkable technique that appears throughout human history going back to the ancient world, in which people rely on themselves with nonviolent means to lift oppression. I also learned that it was possible, even in a terror-ridden state where law officers were working hand in glove with the Ku Klux Klan and vigilantes, that it was possible for organizing for civil and political rights without violence. But even more importantly, I learned that fighting with nonviolent action has properties that allow for more comprehensive change than is ever possible with violence. It is not guaranteed, but campaigns and movements can aim for results that benefit all parties. This is not feasible with violence. I was taught the basics of nonviolent action by the same tutors who taught Martin Luther King, Bayard Rustin, and James Lawson. And therefore, I can say to you assertively, nonviolent struggle must be learned. It is not instinctual. There's nothing inborn about it. Theory and practice are very tightly connected in civil resistance, and there's a lot of learning involved. Now, my conviction that this method for pursuing social justice holds significant potential for the human condition was later at the core of my doctoral studies. In 2006, President Carter asked my husband and me to accompany him to Oslo when he received the Nobel Peace Prize. I just want to tell you this little story because it's a revelation of my own ignorance and ineptitude at the time. So President Carter and my husband and I went to many, many events in Oslo, and one of them was a large conference of educators where he spoke about how in the United States, we on the 4th of July, our Independence Day, celebrate the War of Independence. He was very profoundly struck because in Norway, which won its independence from Sweden without a single bullet, all of the country's school children march up the grandest boulevard in Oslo to shake hands with the king and queen. I am ashamed to say that I had never thought about that until President Carter drew my attention to the difference in the way the two societies celebrated their Independence Day. Going to dig a little bit deeper on the question of the roots of the women's movement and return to the effect that Ella Baker had on all of us on SNCC. In November 1965, my fellow SNCC worker, friend, and colleague Casey Hayden and I wrote a paper entitled Sex and Caste. It came about as a result of exhaustive talks with women, local women, volunteers, staff. We said that the problems of women seeking to function in society as equal human beings were among the most basic dilemmas of humanity. And we mailed it to 40 women who were working in the peace and freedom movements. They, in turn, circulated it widely, and it was published in April 1966. Recipients of that paper began meeting on their own, which would soon be called by historians and social scientists consciousness-raising groups. Widely dispersed, these consciousness-raising groups provided the initial base for what would become the women's liberation movement. Now, any of you who have studied social movements know that one of the things that they do is to open the political space for other constituencies with different grounds to begin mobilizing. The Mississippi Freedom Summer did this not only for blacks and for women, but also for those who were opposing the war in Vietnam and others who were seeking environmental preservation. This is one of the very beneficial aspects of social movements. Many are not aware that the women's liberation movement, as a component of what would eventually be called second wave feminism, arose directly from the experiences of black and white women who had worked in Mississippi Freedom Summer and elsewhere. We had learned how to organize politically, and the experience had spurred us to make claims for justice, equity, and rights for women. Many splits and divisions would fracture the women's movement, yet deeper forces were also at work. It would multiply in both feminism and gender studies, two of the major developments of the 20th century, both of them byproducts, in the sense I'm describing to you, of nonviolent struggle. A number of my colleagues and I believe that the women's liberation movement may have been the most effective liberation struggle in history, in large part because it did not seek to concentrate or centralize leadership. It is leaderless, but also leaderful. Another lesson comes from the book that I did with the New York Times on the Eastern European movements that brought about democratic transitions in the 1980s. I was asked to choose Times articles that helped to tell the story and then to write the narrative connecting them. And I did so for Poland, Hungary, East Germany, Czechoslovakia, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, Georgia, Serbia, and Ukraine. This is a remarkable story that needs more attention because it's a story of how ideas, symbols, strategies, and methods shaped the democratic transitions of the post-World War II, Soviet-occupied, Communist Party-led states. For me, a crucial insight came from studying the Czech struggle in particular. The theater people in Czechoslovakia, activist intellectuals, artists, and so on, they were not pacifists. Priests had been important in Poland, and there were church leaders who were very significant in East Germany, and there were church leaders that were significant in Czechoslovakia. But in fact, the activist intellectuals who were mobilizing, many of them around the theaters of Prague, had comprehended a great irony, which I want to emphasize in this talk. What they understood was that violence was not radical enough to bring about the changes that they sought. And the playwright Václav Havel, who spent 5 years in prison and became the last president of Czechoslovakia and the first president of the Czech Republic, wrote that the dissident movements of the Soviet bloc, quote, do not shy away from the idea of violent political overthrow because the idea seems too radical, but on the contrary, because it is not radical enough. The artists and the playwrights thought it was an error to try to overthrow the Communist Party state because they wanted true change, major transformation of Czechoslovakia and creation of an enduring democracy. Violence could not do that. And indeed, decades of building a civil society culminated in the famous 10 days in late November 1989, in which a national general strike was organized, combined with the effective voice of two groups in civil society, the Civic Forum and Public Against Violence, which brought about a swift nonviolent transition to power. Now, in that same period, the Palestinians were seeking independence from Israeli military occupation. And although dating to 1967, it followed upon losses sustained in 1948. In both their ends and their means, the Eastern European and Palestinian struggles have parallels, which I want to touch on briefly. Again, violence was not revolutionary enough. Palestinian exiles had declared armed struggle a matter of policy in 1968. So what would be revolutionary about having more armed struggle? And that is the basic explanation of how almost the entire society living under military occupation turned to nonviolent methods for almost three years. Civil society was both a surge and a point of origin, and it was also where they hoped to go. And in both Eastern Europe and in the Palestinian setting, unseen by the outside world, dissemination of ideas was occurring. Individuals were leading workshops, translating, publishing. And in both settings, they included Martin Luther King, Gandhi, and Gene Sharp. Networks of committees in both Eastern Europe and amongst the Israelis, there were many, many Israeli committees in support of the 1987 Intifada. Some 64 new Israeli organizations came into existence in order to support the goals, because they were not seeking victory, they were seeking statehood that had long been promised to them. In both settings, the civil societies offered clear political objectives, they rejected fanaticism, and they were aimed at limited dockets of political objectives. And in neither Eastern Europe nor the Eastern Mediterranean was the sharing of power an option. Now, my 2007 book, A Quiet Revolution, that Erica mentioned, explains how the Intifada came about, but it's based on interviews with 150 Israelis and Palestinians. And this is remarkable that on both sides, committees in civil society were going in opposition to the primary flow of ideologies and policies of their societies in seeking to come together to build peace. The situation is more difficult now, but that is still possible. The 1987 Intifada was a quest for methods of struggling, where a militarily preeminent Israel, based by a superpower, had the possibility of sharing that part of the Eastern Mediterranean with the Palestinians. Popular committees of the Palestinians would take reporters into refugee hovels. Now, this is all terribly important because armed struggle had actually left the Palestinians bowed down to Arab state sponsorship and kept them divided, while the PLO was busy working at enforcing its own self-serving, coercive authority, far from preparing the Palestinians for the independence they sought. So the Palestinian pursuit for a state came from memories that Jews were only 8% of the population in Palestine when the British Army arrived in 1917. But more important, from a civil society that had been able to unify the population to seek negotiations to lead to long-promised statehood. That is something that no amount of violence could have brought about those changes of attitudes in those two societies. So again, the lesson was seared into me that violence was not radical enough. And it was expressed to me by a man named Riyad al-Malki, who's now the Foreign Affairs Minister of the Palestinian National Authority. When I asked him in an interview, how do you explain the Intifada? He said, well, we weren't really seeking nonviolence. What we wanted was something truly revolutionary. Does this match with your experience, Sophie? So ironically, we have a very good example of two areas of the world where it's evident that violence was simply not strong enough. And in both cases, the people turned to nonviolent action. Now, I know that there are those of you in the audience who are indeed very sophisticated, and you will be thinking, well, Mary, the 1987 Intifada did not achieve power. This is true. But this is also the first time that world sympathy flowed to the Palestinians for their self-determination. It's also the time when former U.S. Secretary of State James Baker, under the first President Bush, met 7 or 8 times with leaders of the 1987 Intifada. And they were the equivalent of Eastern Europe. They were activist intellectuals. They were academicians, writers, philosophers, physicians, artists, dramatists, and so on. Baker met with leaders of the Intifada. No amount of armed insurrections could have gotten the U.S. Secretary of State to go visit their leaders. It was only nonviolent action. You begin to see where I'm moving and the powers and the properties of nonviolent action. The uprising led to the 1991 Madrid peace talks, which were the first time the Palestinians had sat down for talks with Israelis in a formal setting. There was also a town hall meeting that brought the leaders of the Intifada to world attention. And the Intifada also created a quest for a democratizing movement in the Arab world that it would take another 24 years until the Arab awakening would manifest. More recently, the Israeli Supreme Court has been ruling in favor of West Bank village-based civil resistance campaigns against Israel's separation barrier called the Wall. So nonviolent struggle, I think, remains the best hope for many peoples living under tyranny and oppression. My life has brought me full circle. The codification of internationally recognized human rights has often come about as a consequence of anti-colonial civil rights, democracy, and women's movements, which deliberately avoided the use of violence in pursuing tangible goals. The Human Rights Project itself is actually an outgrowth of nonviolent resistance. I'm going to return to women briefly and come to your questions as soon as I can. A colleague of mine, Anne-Marie Codur, who's a French economist, have studied many, many movements of women throughout the ages and have discerned that women seem to have certain strategic advantages in nonviolent action. They are oftentimes able to maintain nonviolent discipline inside campaigns and movements in a way that men are not always able to do so. The presence of women can actually lower the level of violence, repression, and reprisals from security forces. Women appear to prefer to organize in horizontal collective networks that often prove to be more efficient and resilient for a movement than top-down hierarchical systems. Women appear to display fewer internal rivalries. Also, JJ, women have a demonstrable ability, greater than that of men, it appears, we're still observing, to build connections of solidarity across and beyond societal and cultural lines of division. We've seen this in many places. Srebrenica, Liberia, many parts of the world. I'm going to conclude by saying that my final lesson that I would share with you is a warning. And it relates to something that is really quite important for nonviolent movements. I spent hundreds of hours in archives in New Delhi and Kerala researching the book that Erica mentioned at the end of her introduction. There was a village in Kerala, India, in which for centuries anyone could walk, animal, pig, dog, any person except for untouchable Indians. And there was a struggle that began in the 1920s that Gandhi led. That's the subject of my latest book. Now, I admire Gandhi's contributions to the world enormously, but in this case, he made a mistake. He thought that the Brahmin leaders could be persuaded and convinced through the sight of the suffering of the untouchables to change their privilege. They own most of the land, even today in Kerala. And unfortunately, there is absolutely nothing in any archives that substantiate this. The change that has come about for untouchables has come about as a result of their own organizing, their own movements of uplift. So I'm going to move to the conclusion right now. But I want to call attention to the fact that a great deal of harm can be done by exaggerating the outcomes of nonviolent struggles. And what happened is that during the 1930s, reports traveled around the world that the Brahmins had been persuaded and converted by the suffering of the untouchables. There's no truth to this. At best, conversion is an ideal. It's a fine ideal, but it should never have been reported as an actual fact. When I accompanied President Carter to Oslo, I kept thinking about what Martin Luther King had said when he won the Nobel Peace Prize in 1964. What he said is, I venture to suggest, above all, that nonviolence become immediately a subject for study and serious experimentation in every field of human conflict, by no means excluding relations between nations, which ultimately make war. In the half-century since, however, this has not happened. Civil resistance has never had the resources that have been allocated to democratization or development, the environment, human rights aspect of national security. I hope that perhaps some of you in the room, that may be beginning to change. So I'm going to close and move to questions by urging that each of us who is here today take it upon ourselves to restore and reclaim, to understand more deeply the contributions that civil resistance has made to shaping the society of the United States, the history of the United States, and the societies and history of the rest of the world. And we can start by recognizing that Dr. King's famous watchword, some of you will be well familiar with this quote, "The arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends toward justice." This is not Dr. King speaking. This is a 19th century abolitionist named Theodore Parker. I also know you know about Dr. King's phrase, the beloved community, which we articulated all the time as the goal of the civil rights movement. But that too dates to the 19th century. It's in a book that rested on my father's desk throughout my childhood, which was written in the middle of World War I. So I would encourage each of us energetically to explore the richness of American thought and the American experience with civil resistance. These chapters are ours to be retrieved and recovered. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Mary. Your remarks were staggeringly detailed and useful, as expected. And I'm I'm sure that there are a lot of people in the audience that have specific questions that they want to ask you, and we'll have plenty of time for that. I'm going to use my dialogue prerogative to ask you a couple myself. I'll get the first big one out of the way. Can you help us? What should we be doing? I know you've been thinking about what people who are movement-minded in the United States ought to be doing right now. And in fact, that's going to be kind of the key question motivating the James Lawson Institute that you'll be directing at the end of this month. But if there are 2 or 3 big pieces of information that you would like to convey to this eager audience here of movement makers, we would be quite delighted to entertain them. Oh, okay. Do you think they're here? Maybe they're in here.
Let me see if I can find. Okay. Well, I think what's very important to recognize is that we in the United States have the largest and healthiest civil society in the history of the human race. That's a plus for this moment. We have independent institutions, committees. We have people who are connected in myriad networks and councils and alliances and coalitions. Americans are very, very active. This is a real plus. However, not all of it is as well prepared and as well planned as it needs to be in order to have effectiveness. When something is organized by way of a nonviolent direct action, the claims and the demands, the goals need to be very, very crystal clear. It has to be utterly apparent as to what the group is working toward. This is often not the case. Some groups are calling for demonstrations on such and such a date of every month or on such and such a day of every week. But what we need is a more intentional targeting of particular claims and demands that are to be accomplished. And there are many ways that this can be done. You are involved in doing that. The people who are working here in the C Center are involved in doing that. All of you are scholars who are studying the practice and action elements of what is happening today. But we also need to be more bold among ourselves in trying to learn how to be effective in using this technique. Because, as I said, there's nothing intuitive or inborn about it. It really takes study. There's a logic to nonviolent action that has to be understood. So I think that this is really extremely important.
Thank you. Earlier today, you and I were talking about the nomenclature of nonviolent resistance and the ways in which we can effectively talk to people, both people who are familiar with nonviolent resistance or are involved in nonviolent resistance, but also those who are new to the topic. And one thing you said during your remarks that people come to learn that violence in their situations is not radical enough. What are the ways that you found most effective in expressing this idea or persuading people to consider that violence is not radical enough in our time?
Well, this is a very, very difficult question because, in point of fact, most people believe that military force is the greatest force on earth. Now, it's only through the study of nonviolent struggle that you learn of the dictators and the tyrants whose regimes were collapsed only through nonviolent struggle. So it's not an easy pitch to make when we are celebrating the War of Independence as the basis of our 4th of July, and we have a larger military than the next ever so many 14 countries or so below us and so on. What we need to recognize, all of us, is that there are deficits in our appreciation of the fact that there's a great deal that violent struggle cannot accomplish. And a huge, immense track record of success for nonviolent action, which is understudied. I've been doing some interviewing in Mississippi, and I was in Neshoba County, which is where my 3 fellow civil rights workers were abducted and murdered by the Ku Klux Klan. But it was the deputy sheriff and others in the sheriff's office who turned them over to the Ku Klux Klan to be murdered. And I met with several black leaders in one particular school, and I asked them about, how much do you teach what happened here in Philadelphia to the students? And one of them said, oh yes, every February in Black History Month we teach about this. Not enough in Neshoba County to be talking about what happened there in 1964 once a year in February because it's Black History Month. It needs to be looked at all the time. The children need to be raised with an open acknowledgement of what happened, what was the price that was paid, how has society been able to reconstruct itself. There are indeed some good news elements to this, but the children are not even getting the good news stories. So this is very, very, very tricky because our whole trajectory is on a perception of force, military force being the greatest strength. And in fact, the lesson from Eastern Europe is so apparent that it was only these national nonviolent revolutions. In fact, the word revolution changed meaning as a consequence of what happened in Eastern Europe. It was as a result of these national nonviolent revolutions. Revolution is no longer associated with blood. You can have all sorts of revolutions now, including nonviolent revolutions. But that was the very, very strong lesson from Eastern Europe. That was only those national mobilizations that were able to bring about internal deflation within the Communist Party states. In Hungary, it was Communist Party reformers who responded. Also, in East Germany, you had vast, huge series of 18 demonstrations in late 1989, some of which were 500,000, 250,000 large. This was the only way in which there could finally have gotten, the message went through to Gorbachev that there could be no use of violence against the Eastern European and former Eastern Bloc. And eventually in East Berlin on October 6, 1989, he said decisions for East Germany will be made in East Berlin, which was a signal that the Soviet Union would not invade as it had earlier in history. So much of the answer to your question comes from the framing of history and the awareness that we need to cultivate, that we need to do a better job of teaching history.
So my last question before we open it up to the audience is, we have a number of students here who are eager to embark on their own research projects or continue those already underway. So what would you say are the 2 or 3 most important understudied topics in civil resistance today?
You know, many nonviolent movements, including ours, the one in which I worked for 4 years, don't really plan for what happens afterwards. This is a huge deficit. I understand and appreciate that oppositional movements have a lot of trouble with the kind of forward planning that governments should actually be doing. I'm sympathetic to that. I do appreciate it. But those who are working in nonviolent mobilizations need to do a very good job of thinking through, if we succeed, then what do we do? It's a simple question. It doesn't require an academician to tell you. If we succeed, now what? Think about it long in advance. Start preparing, start building what will be needed for whatever the change, the administration of change requires. I think that It's also the case that many nonviolent movements end in very jagged, tattered ways. We can look at the Arab awakening as perfect examples. There are tens of thousands of people are in prison in Egypt, and the situation is, many people believe, much worse than it was with Hosni Mubarak. But we have to also think about, we have to plan for dealing with internal forces and external forces and how they have to be greeted and met. I also, let me just tab onto this, that I think that right now in the United States, we have a very important moment that seems to be opening up as a result of a kind of upsurge from the grassroots local levels, which is there appears to be a quest for atonement for the bitter history of the country. And we see this in lots and lots of communities where there are individual churches or schools or groups that are confronting things that occurred in the 19th century. And I think that this is a moment in time that needs to be seized by the people that you've gathered here today. We have an opportunity now to ask what kind of a society is it that we want going forward, and to face the fact that we need to be having very, very deep discussions about what has happened here in the past. Much of this requires a quest for forgiveness, the bestowal of forgiveness, a quest for reconciliation. This is what Professor Avant was talking about. This kind of comprehensive change is possible with nonviolent action, not possible with violent action. And that's something for everybody here to be thinking about, is how do we ask some of these larger, deeper questions? We're going to have to face our history one way or another. As part of the reason why I shared with you that one of my forebears had freed his slaves in his will. If we don't talk about these things, we are never going to be able to build this kind of society that we want to build. We've got to open up the sluice gates and begin communicating about the price that we have paid in the United States for some of the chapters in our history. And there is corrective action that is possible in the context of a nonviolent movement that's very amenable, because it's possible to construct a campaign in which all parties will benefit. Unlike violent struggle, which requires the subjugation of one side.
Excellent. So for those who have questions, please line up, or actually Rachel will come around with the mic and fire away. We have about 20 minutes left. Please introduce yourself as well, so that Mary can remember your name, which she most definitely will.
Thank you for your remarks. I'm Sheila Davis. I'm the director for the Center of Health Equity Initiatives. Along the lines of building alternative institutions, could you say a word or two about the Freedom Schools? And what role do you see those schools playing today, if any?
Well, this is a terrific question. You remember that I mentioned that Gandhi had something called the Constructive Program, a booklet that was published in 1941. And his advocacy that in some situations where the injustice was so egregious, or where it would require intergenerational change, that you remove yourself from the source of the oppression and begin building institutions that could allow you to effect what you were working toward in the future, but right now. The Freedom Schools were one of the alternative institutions that we developed, in particularly Mississippi, where it was too dangerous for direct action. And we had 38 of them. Not in all of the state's 82 counties, I'm sorry to say, but we did have 38 of them. We recruited nearly 1,000 students from across the United States from universities to come as teachers. It was to have lasted for 8 weeks, but many of them continued. I guarantee you that the local people with whom we lived and worked were aware of the fact that they were getting a severely deprived education for their children. They knew it. they understood that they were not getting anything like what the white schools were offering. The freedom schools were tremendously potentiating. I thank you so much for your question, because earlier this year I interviewed the mayor of Chula, Mississippi in Holmes County, and the first thing he insisted on doing was sitting me down and showing me pictures of him as a child in the Freedom School in Holmes County. And he was more proud of that than he was of being mayor of the town. This is still talked about in Mississippi. It still has a big effect. The Children's Defense Fund, led by Marion Wright Edelman, who's one of my fellow workers in SNCC, is organizing freedom schools in different parts of the country. And I'm very, very happy to see this development because, first of all, it acknowledges that there are areas and issues and themes and yearnings and aches that cannot be addressed always in the contours of a public education curriculum. It's going to take more. Freedom schools can be very close to the ground, and they can address areas that need compensation for communities. I think that this is a tremendous force. I hope to see it develop. It is an alternative institution because, in fact, in theory at least, our public schools should be able to do this education. But I recognize that that is not always possible, and I'm glad to see this parallel institution arise. And Gandhi, too, would be very, very much approving of this development. He would say this is exactly what you need to do where there are deficits in education.
Good afternoon. My name is Yilan Buka, and I'm a postdoctoral fellow here at the C Center. First of all, I'd like to thank you for your remarks and for sharing with us all this history that most of us didn't know anything about. So thank you very much for doing it so graciously. I study political violence in Sub-Saharan Africa. And
in Eastern Africa?
In Central and Eastern Africa. And initially, when I started reading about nonviolent struggle, I was not convinced because as we've seen in Sub-Saharan Africa and Southern Africa and Central and Eastern Africa, oftentimes there's been the use of violence to uproot dictators. But one thing that I started to evaluate as I've been researching the ways in which post-struggle governments govern after they take over is the reality that you mentioned that it doesn't change things radically. What you often see is a uprooting of a dictator only to replace it with another, because non-state armed groups, when they take leadership, are not very good at promoting democratic change. At the same time, I'm wondering whether there's been any part in your research, whether academic or in activism, where you've seen an intersection of violence and nonviolence pushing together towards change. Not asking because I'm advocating violence, only because I've seen cases where the differential between the oppressed and the holders of power is so great that violent movement have actually had an impact in putting pressure on some governments. So I guess the question that I'm asking ultimately is, have you ever seen ways in which armed groups and nonviolent groups have had similar goals and have found ways to work together and maybe influence, nonviolent groups influencing violent groups to achieve their objectives? Thank you.
Actually, I would have to say that through the length and breadth and depth of my studies and my experience, I have never seen such an instance. And the reason is that the kind of power used in nonviolent action is entirely different from the kind of power used in violence. So in nonviolent action, we're dealing with social power. That is the power, all the power available in a society that is not under the control of the military or the security. It's available for mobilization. It's there, it's latent, it's dormant in the society. But with violent power, you're dealing with a kind of subjugation. In nonviolent struggle, you are actually able to create comprehensive programs for what you're aiming for without threatening the lives or the welfare of the opponent. When that happens, you may see defections. Nonviolent struggle is the only form of struggle in which it's possible to reach into the enemy's camp, so to speak. I use the word enemy in quotation marks. It's the only means of struggle where you can reach into the enemy's camp and begin to cause shifts. It's possible if you maintain nonviolent discipline with enough precision, it's possible that inside the ranks of the security or the military, there begins to be a questioning of why are we standing here armed against an unarmed civilian mobilization. Here are mothers with babies and priests and children. Why are we having arms against them? That is the moment at which you begin to have people who question their orders, begin disobeying their orders, and some will come over to the nonviolent movement, as happened in the Philippines. But unless you reckon with the fact that these are two entirely different uses of power, it's not really possible to discuss the question you're asking. I think your question is a very good one, but I know of no data that substantiates the possibility of combining both of these two very, very different uses of power. One of the things that's at play in Africa is that Africa has had a vast amount of nonviolent action, but it has not been documented. And I've known this because I was the academic advisor for 21 workshops on nonviolent struggle that I coordinated and put together in Africa for the University for Peace. And over and over and over again, students and faculty alike would say, "Oh, I didn't know what we were doing was nonviolent action." I actually had a student once who stood up in class. She stood up, she said, "Oh," she said, "I'm from Zambia." I suddenly realized we had a movement that started in the churches that every Friday for 1 hour, wherever you were, you stopped your car and you honked your horn. And this was against the president who had been elected to office, but intended to keep the office for life. And she said, "I had no idea what we were doing all over the country and honking the horns every Friday afternoon for an hour. This is nonviolent action." She was so thrilled and excited. So I've been talking about our problems in the United States with history, but they're actually global problems. The study of nonviolent struggles always gets short shrift. And this has been the case in Africa also, so that it's sometimes even really very hard. It takes a couple of days to get into the workshop because there's so many misperceptions, and you have to establish a nomenclature, a lexicon, a vocabulary for talking about these things. But I know of no efficacious combination of violence with nonviolence, which is not to say that there have not been instances in history where one followed the other. I'm not saying that. I'm saying that they cannot be strategically combined.
We have time for one more question.
Thank you so much. It's so great to have you here. And I should start by saying I believe you about the overall effectiveness of nonviolence, and I also very much agree with all your statements about how the more we confront the past honestly, the better. But I do have a question about Eastern Europe, which is the area in which I specialize.
You have a question about?
Eastern Europe. So there's an alternative reading of what happened there to what you've suggested, which is that because the empire, the Soviet Empire, had so much difficulty in sustaining itself economically, by 1987, Gorbachev was really forced to pull back his political support and actually indicated as early as 1987 that he wasn't going to back up militarily the regimes in Eastern Europe anymore. And in fact, there's a 1985 article by a former mentor of mine, Valerie Bunce. She wrote this great article, which was called The Empire Strikes Back, which was about the economic costs that the Soviets were having to sustain for their East European empire. And that's one of the few scholarly articles that really anticipated the end of the Cold War. So my point about this is the East Europeans were, over a very long period of time, engaged in nonviolent resistance. And as you said, they were often put down militarily. The difference by 1988 and 1989 is they no longer at that point had the Soviet backing, and they knew it. So I guess what I'm wondering in part is, how do we defend the salience of those cases and nonviolent resistance, given that the structural situation had shifted so dramatically already by the time those regimes were thrown out of power?
Well, I think that's a very good question, because in fact there's a debate as to whether structure or skills are the most significant and effectual in this. And I think it needs to remain a debate, because there's so many instances where there is a very unclear picture. But we also see a situation where reformers inside the Communist Party states were able to make advantageous use of the fact that there were now citizens organizing in small committees. There was Samizdat, the forbidden literature, that there were policies being broken, that the countries were not supposed to exchange information with each other, and that was changing. There were a lot of other changes that were indisputably, the changes taking place in the Soviet Union were part of this. But you also had in Poland the jailers and the jailed sitting down to begin the talks that would reframe Polish society and its democracy months before we would see any action from the reformers in East Germany, for example. So there is qualitatively, I believe, something very considerable of what happened in Eastern Europe as a consequence of all of the mobilizing. I believe it's 1982 when in East Germany the first march emerges from one of the churches in Leipzig with people carrying small votive candles that could be blown out with a slightest breeze. And 1982 is long before the period that you're talking about. And there was beginning to be a refusal to cooperate with the Stasi. In the pastors' movement, the churches threw open their doors on Monday for those who wanted to come for prayers for peace. And they said, you do not need to be a believer, but if you wish to join us to talk about and pray for peace, feel free to. And what they did was to have two rules. One was that everything should be nonviolent, and secondly, you must identify yourself. So they were insisting that if someone was going to speak, they stand up and say, I'm Frau Müller, I'm from such and such a village. That was evidence that they were no longer standing in fear of the Stasi, the secret police, because they would stand up and identify themselves and where they were from. That began in the early 1980s, quite early. So we have a number of forces at work. I grant you the validity of that. I know President Gorbachev individually. I've talked with him about these issues. There were many things at work. Thank you for your question.
So as you can tell, we're in the presence of a national treasure, if not a global treasure. I know that Mary is happy to stay back and talk with anybody who'd like to line up and say something personally, but thank you so much again, my friend, for spending this time with us. And it's just been really useful.
Thank you, all of you.